can get started.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and thank you all so much for joining me on this Monday. My name is Dana Flightman. I'm an associate advisor with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, which is a project of Equitas. And I really appreciate you taking the time during these strange days to sit down and learn a little bit more about stalking. So I'm sure that'll cheer you right up in these uncertain times. One thing I'm curious about is, Daniel, if you could pull up this poll, how many of you have had the opportunity to attend a training on stalking before this webinar? So if you could let me know, my first stalking training, I've been to maybe one, or, oh my goodness, I could lead this. I don't even know why I'm listening, really. So I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, great. So it looks like about half the folks are saying maybe 1 to 3, and about a third are saying, this is my first training. And the other, of course, everyone, feel free to chime in with whatever knowledge and expertise. You all have a lot of it, so it's always great to learn from each other in the chat box. And, you know, I always start the training, whether it's in person or online, by asking that question. And I do trainings on stalking all over the country for groups ranging from, you know, campuses, law enforcement, victim advocates, social workers, and I always ask that question, and typically half to the whole room have never had the opportunity to attend a stalking training prior to whichever one that SPARC is leading. And it's just an issue that's really, really undertrained and underdiscussed in our field, and I just want to remind folks that, you know, stalking is one of the 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. But it's always kind of and stalking. You know, we almost call their website andstalking.org because it's something that's so often overlooked. And yet, as you'll see, you know, it's a prevalent crime, and it's one that I know with the essential work that you're doing, you're already working with stalking victims, survivors, and possibly offenders, depending what your role is. But you may not be looking at your work quite through that lens because it's so undertrained. So I hope by the end of this webinar, you're moving that and stalking a little bit more to the beginning of your sentence and seeing your work through that lens. So SPARC is funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. And again, we are a project of Equitas. Our website is stalkingawareness.org. So we did not go with andstalking.org. On there we have training modules. So if you do any kind of public awareness education on a campus or in your community, we have scripted PowerPoint presentations on there so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as well as some tools and activities. We have resources for victims, so we're not a direct service provider, but we do have some guidance around safety planning, and we have brochures that you can order, print brochures that you can distribute in your community with some information on understanding stalking and a space to put in your own local agency information. We also have guidance for practitioners, and we break that out by the different kinds of professionals. So we have some specifically for law enforcement, for victim advocates, for awareness educators, for corrections, for prosecution, so definitely check those out. And webinars like this one. We archive our past ones and we have future ones. So at the end of this one, you're like, man, I wish I could hear Dana talk more. You can, because we always keep our past webinars on the website. We're also on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our 6 sense of humor at SPARC, if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really, your call either way. We also have a newsletter we send around quarterly, sometimes a little bit more than that, and you can subscribe to that on our website to keep in touch with us and learn about new resources and opportunities. So why learn about stalking, besides that it's one of those 4 crimes and probably somewhere in your grant it says that you need to address it? Well, stalking is a really important crime to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories. It might be a misdemeanor. It might be a felony, depending on your jurisdiction and the situation. But it is a crime. It is a crime at the federal level, in tribal codes, and the military justice system. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is a crime, and that's victims as well as responders. So you have victims saying, well, what, am I going to call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or sent me a gift that I didn't want? Well, if it's part of a stalking criminal course of conduct, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, yes, they should, because stalking is a crime. There is something we can do about it. It's criminal and it's traumatic. So quite often when I hear people talk about the urgency of recognizing stalking cases, they go right to that co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is incredibly important, and I'll talk about it in just a couple slides. But I want to pause here and say that even if the stalking in no way predicts or co-occurs with physical violence, it's still a crime in its own right because it's a deeply traumatic experience for victims and survivors. So many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be lifelong and severe. Quite a few lose time from work. So 1 in 8 lose some time, more than half lose 5 days of work or more. And like domestic violence victims, stalking victims are typically not a protected class of worker. So if a stalking victim goes to their employer and says, here's some accommodations I need to feel safer, the employer can be wonderful, or they can say, you're fired, and that's inconvenient for the company, right? And typically they're allowed to do that. And quite a few relocate. So that really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? When you've decided to move for hopefully a good reason, and still to how expensive and stressful it is to pack up your things and pack up your family and relocate. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that choice as a result of their victimization. So I think that really goes to illustrate just how traumatic and consuming this crime really is. It's always powerful to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's a quote from a stalking survivor saying, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And this is very typical quote of a stalking survivor because the stalker creates the feeling that they're always there, they're always watching, and stalkers can be quite persistent. So many victims have told me, I knew the day that probation ended or I got out of jail that they'd call me, and they did. So it's that feeling that it's never really over. And stalking is dangerous. So it often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. About 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to actually directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. In fact, this one researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. It is these what seemingly smaller incidents adding up and sometimes escalating over time. Sometimes it does, doesn't always go in a straight line. But when you look back at especially an intimate partner homicide, for example, and it's not about, playing Monday morning quarterback, but if you look back at that homicide, you'll almost always see stalking that led up to that event. But the good thing about this is it gives us an opportunity because it's one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can prevent violence and even death. So when we recognize that stalking is going on, when we take it seriously, we can intervene and stop not only the trauma and start healing the trauma that that victim or survivor is experiencing, but also hopefully prevent more serious violence. And yet it's really underreported. So less than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement, and this is similar to domestic violence and sexual assault are also quite underreported for some of the same reasons. Certainly many victims feel it's a personal matter. They might feel embarrassed. They might distrust law enforcement. And I think in the case of stalking, perhaps specifically, a lot of the general public doesn't realize that stalking is a crime. And so they don't realize that something criminal has occurred that even could be reported. We also see a lot of minimization of people saying, oh, I can handle this myself, it's no big deal, and not really accepting the reality and the danger that they're in. But let's say they do report it. So this was a small study of almost 2,000 domestic violence cases in Colorado. almost 300 involved stalking, which is about 1 in 6. So here we had clear documented evidence of stalking in 298 cases. So tell me in the chat box, about how many of these cases do you think were actually charged as stalking? You can just throw out a number out of that 298. I see 5%, 3, 15%. The first person was right. It is 1. Only 1 case was actually charged as stalking. And so, you know, there's plenty of factors that go into charging decisions, but we think, again, it points to that really lack of awareness and understanding of stalking, so that even when folks are looking at it, it's not being reported, and if it is reported, it's not being identified and charged. But that's okay. We're going to fix it in this webinar. So first we'll talk about understanding stalking, the behavioral definition, some different stalking behaviors. We'll briefly touch on the intersection with intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And then I'll leave you with some resources, and hopefully we'll talk later. So I'm saying stalking's so bad, you have to do something about it. What is it exactly? Well, for stalking, there's the behavioral definition and the legal definition. Of course, your statutes vary depending what state that you're in, and we're more than happy to do a deep dive with you on your statute because it's important. We want to focus here today on the behavioral definition, and I think that's really critical regardless of what your statute says, because the behavioral definition is going to give us a better sense of what stalking really looks like and how stalkers really behave. And even if you find that, oh, my statute has a really high bar for charging, for example, so I can't charge it as stalking, you still want to recognize that behavior as stalking because it's its own dangerous behavior that requires its own safety planning. So we still want to understand what it looks like. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and so Daniel's created these polls. And what I'd like you to do is vote. All of these scenarios are a negative situation. They might even all be criminal. But are they stalking? So here's the first one. A student peeks into the women's locker room. Does that sound, again, we don't like it. Does it sound like stalking? I'll give you a few seconds to vote, and there's a poll, so you should be able to click on that. Okay, so we have most folks saying no, and some people saying yes. Okay. And then the next scenario, an ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking? Yes or no? Okay, it looks like that one's a little bit more split. So we have about 60% saying yes and 40% saying no. Okay, and last but not least, we have this really bad supervisor. So they're regularly asking her employee personal questions, mocking him in meetings, sending emails at weird hours, and being abusive when he doesn't respond right away, verbally abusive. Does that sound like stalking? Okay, so it looks like most folks are saying yes. We're split around 70% yes, but around 30% no. Okay, so thanks for doing that. So when you were going through that and thinking to yourself, a few questions might have kind of arisen in your mind. You might be thinking, well, how many times would this have to happen? And does it have to be directed at someone specific, or could it be at different people? So luckily, I'm going to explain that here in the behavioral definition and use those scenarios as examples. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it is a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or a one-off event, and just about every statute defines a pattern as 2 or more. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me today kind of use those terms interchangeably, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm really talking about the same thing, which is that 2 or more incidents, which is those 2 or more incidents. And stalking behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Daniel because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay? So maybe Monday, I text him all day. Tuesday, I get mad he didn't respond. I smash his windows. Wednesday, I feel guilty. I send him flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, even though texting somebody or sending a gift are not generally criminal. They can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So a lot of stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like vandalism, property damage, with other behaviors that outside the context of stalking would not be crimes. And it's challenging because our system tends to be quite incident-based. And so it's much easier to get a response to that property damage, which is clear, obvious, and we can see it, than it is to those other behaviors. And so we need to think broadly about all the stalking behaviors going on. And when we hear from victims, be thinking, is this a single incident or is this part of a pattern of behavior that might be combining behaviors, some of which are crimes on their own, some of which are not. So it's a pattern of behavior, it's 2 or more incidents, and it's directed at a specific person. So in that first scenario where a student peeks into the women's locker room, that might still be criminal, but it's not really stalking because he's not targeting a specific person, right? That student is just looking at whoever happens to be there. Now, that being said, it could become stalking. So let's say that student then identifies women from the locker room, finds them on social media and contacts them and says, you better XYZ or I will, show these photos I took while you're in there or something like that. Okay, now we could be looking at a stalking and extortion case, right? But because it's only one incident, the peeking in one time, and it was not directed at anyone specific, then that's not really stalking unless he followed someone in there. So again, it could be part of a stalking case, but on its own, it wouldn't be stalking because stalking is directed at a specific person. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe an offender, let's say they're stalking an ex-partner, and the ex-partner starts dating someone new. So now that stalker is targeting their ex as well as the ex's new partner. And a stalker is very likely to reach out to a victim's family, friends, colleagues. So certainly a lot of folks can become involved in a stalking case and might even be considered co-victims, right? But it's still in the context and purpose of reaching that one individual. They are trying to get to that victim, and they will use other people to do it. And so in that way, behaviorally, we see it as directed at a specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to the definition of stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime that's often confused with, which is harassment. So if you think back to that third scenario about the really bad supervisor, that's more of a harassment case. So if my supervisor is, emailing me at 2 a.m. and then yelling at me in front of the staff at 9 a.m. for not responding, okay, she's terrible and I should go to HR. Because harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel disrespected, angry, and harassment can be quite serious. So I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. Now, let's say that supervisor then starts, I'm driving home and I see her behind me. She's texting my husband. I don't know how she got his number. She texts me a picture of myself walking my dog and says, why are you doing that instead of working? Okay, now I'm scared, right? So harassment can become stalking, can be part of a stalking course of conduct, but it's that fear component that really makes stalking stalking. And I see this misused all the time. I'll read a case that says, she received 50 death threats. It was extreme harassment. Well, I don't know about you, but when I get my death threats, I'm not just annoyed, I'm scared, right? And so when there's that fear component, we're really talking about stalking. And it's important because typically when we come to charging decisions, stalking is often a higher charge than harassment and also might bring in some more Title IX kind of considerations if you're campus-based. So we definitely want to call it what it is. But fear is difficult, right? Because fear is quite personal. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video, and if you can't hear it, you'll still get the idea. And I want you to think which of these folks you identify with more. I'm going to stop it there. That's the whole thing. So some of you might really hate the spider, in which case, apologies. But my guess is that quite a few of you can understand where this face that we're seeing right now from this man is coming from, right? It's this little thing, and this woman is freaking out, and what's the big deal, But what if I told you that a year ago, this woman had been bitten by a spider that looked just like that, and she had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? hopefully you would not still be making this face at her, right? Because what did I give you there? I gave you context. I gave you information. And that's really critical in stalking cases. And can we go back to the slides, Daniel, here? Thanks. Context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what's scary to a victim does not seem scary to an outsider or responder. So for example, this was a case where this woman called the police. She was hysterical. And all she would say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So understandably, the police are not like sending out the SWAT team. You know, they're kind of like, "You prefer tea? Like, what is your problem?" And eventually she calmed down enough and said, "He's here." So it turned out this was a stalking survivor who had moved. The offender was an abusive ex-boyfriend, moved, address confidentiality, the whole thing. Really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So unfortunately, I can't see or hear you, but typically when I tell that story, people make it like, sort of noise or face or shake their heads. And what that tells me is that a reasonable person would feel fear, right? Assuming my audiences are reasonable people and being very generous, right? That's scary. It's really scary when we know the story. But if we don't know and all we hear is there's coffee in the car, we're like, "Oh my God, this is awesome. How do I get a car like this? These smart cars have everything," right? And that's why that context is so critical. So we need to remember that something may be scary to the victim, but not to you. And so we need to ask. We need to ask, what message did that send to you? What about that was scary to you? Tell me more about that. Tell me the story behind that, so that we can understand why that behavior is causing that reaction in a victim. Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. Like the classic example is an offender saying something like, "I'll send you roses the day I kill you." And then the victim receives roses, maybe in a public place like a workspace, and the coworkers are oohing and awing, and the victim's terrified, right? And so again, we need to ask victims what's going on, and again, it's really the context that makes a lot of stalking behaviors criminal in the first place. So is it happening in the context of a stalking case? Now it's a crime. And the truth is we want to take victims seriously for a variety of reasons, but one is that victim fear, multiple studies have shown that victim fear is an excellent predictor of victim danger. So in other words, if a victim's afraid, there's probably a good reason. So Janet, if you can pull the video back up, we're going to see how this spider situation plays out. All right, so we don't want to be that guy, right? It turns out the victim was actually having a very proportional response, and we just didn't know, or this man didn't know that, right? And so he made some assumptions and went in acting like this isn't a big thing. And unfortunately, we see that in our response to stalking victims sometimes. We see multidisciplinary professionals saying, well, it sounds like it's just text messages, or it doesn't really seem like that big a deal, or that's not a, I don't really get how that's a threat, and acting like it's not, not urgent when actually it is. But is it fear? I mean, when most stalking victims reach out to you, they're unlikely to say, hi, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking. Like, if they do say that to you, please call me. I'll be like, our awareness efforts are so good. But probably they won't, right? They're more likely to say something like, my ex is being weird, my neighbor is being creepy, an old professor is making things awkward, my friend's harassing me. That's the kind of language they're likely to use. And it's up to us to be thinking, could this really be about fear? And could this really be about stalking and not those other words? Because a lot of folks don't love to admit when they're afraid. That may not be the first term they use. And of course, different people react differently to traumatic experiences. So people may not be presenting as afraid. They might seem more angry or have no affect at all. And a lot of victims really minimize the stalking situation because it's a pattern, and what's abnormal starts to feel normal. So for example, I talked to a law enforcement officer who said they got a call from a stalking victim, and the victim was so happy, and the victim said, today's a great day, he's only driven by my house 7 times. And the officer was like, it's 9 a.m. Like, what are you talking about? It's a good day. And the victim said, yeah, but by this time, usually he's driven by like 20 times. And so it's not to say that that victim isn't a reasonable person. It's that victim was responding to this repeated trauma where something abnormal has become normalized and now minimized. And that's where behaviorally that reasonable person standard is actually helpful, because even if that victim's saying, oh, it's not a big deal, I'm not scared, if a reasonable person, if most of us would go, when we heard that, or if that happened to us, that could still be stalking, right? And so it's still a good way to think about it. The thing is, I actually hear the word stalking all the time, and not just because of my work. And so I often hear the word stalking used casually. So for example, you might hear something like this, I was totally Facebook stalking you. I saw you went to Mexico. It looked awesome, right? And assuming you hear this, I was stalking you online, whatever, through Instagram. So assuming these people know each other and are Facebook friends and are on good terms, does this sound like stalking? Does this sound like actual stalking? No, because there's no fear, right? It's not scary. If you post a picture to social media and a friend of yours who is a friend of yours on that social media platform looks at it, that's not scary. Like, if that's scary to you, you shouldn't post that picture, right? I mean, that's how social media works. So when people use stalking in this way, they're not really talking about stalking. And the problem with this is, while it doesn't create stalkers, it does create an environment where we minimize stalking, and it kind of dilutes the seriousness of the term, right? Because, and it's a bit unique to this crime. Like, no one says, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson, right? That's not a thing. So if you say there's arson at your home, people are like, oh man, you got to call the police. Like, that's a crime. But with stalking, you get this kind of like, well, was it stalking or was it stalking? And that's a problem for victims and their reporting. It's a problem for victims when they tell their friends and loved ones. Do their loved ones say, oh, that sounds scary, we should do something? Or do they say, it just sounds like someone being a little awkward? And for us as responders as well, it can minimize our response and our sense of urgency. And so, I encourage you to think about your use of that term, as well as the impact that sort of the casualness, I guess, of that term can kind of influence our response. Any questions on the behavioral definition of stalking before I move on to prevalence and behavior? No, I nailed it. You loved it. Okay, cool. So stalking, prevalence, and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. In the United States, about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking. And so if you think about the rates of domestic violence, it would be, around 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women. Sexual violence just on campuses, around 1 in 5 women. So stalking is really right up there with 1 in 6 women, and yet it's that and stalking, often an afterthought, not a lot of standalone stalking resources. I also want to say we know that stalking impacts people of all gender identities, but the best available data is presented to ask folks to identify as women or men, and so that's what I'm repeating to you. So 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men. So people, again, all people can experience stalking and do. Women experience it at much higher rates than men do, and the vast majority of victims report that their offender was male. This is true overwhelmingly for female victims, where over 80% of the time the offender is male. It's also true about 50% of the time for male victims, where their offender is male. And so outside of an LGBT context, maybe thinking, well, why is that happening? And quite a bit of it is about ex-partners stalking the victim's new partner, so that ex-boyfriend stalking the new boyfriend or husband. And of course, we know that stalking happens in the LGBT community as well. And through the small studies that we have, as well as talking to victim advocates on the ground, the rates might be higher than in the general population, similar to domestic violence and sexual assault, but we just don't have a great national study on it yet. So if I Google image results for stalking, which I do because I'm fun, these are the kind of pictures I get. So as you can see, you get a lot of these kind of binoculars, hoodies, alleyway, kind of implying these lurking strangers. I like this person in the middle who's wearing like a hoodie and a mask and behind a computer, but did not cover their webcam. But you get this kind of following in the shadows sort of stranger vibe. And I'm sure it will not surprise you at all to know that the vast majority of the time the offender knows the victim and the victim knows the offender. So again, I don't expect you to be surprised by that because of the work that you do, but I will say that when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this because when most people in the general public think about stalking, they think about celebrity stalkers. So they're thinking the Kardashians, they're thinking of Taylor Swift, and indeed our stalking laws do actually come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaefer's murder in the 90s that led California to pass the first stalking law in the nation. So that's not wrong, but it's not really what we're talking about as criminal justice and service providers, right? And so it's a myth that you might encounter among victims where they'll say, well, it's not stalking because I know that person, when in fact it's the people that we know that are most likely to be the offender. And so about half the time overall, that offender is a current or former intimate partner. But I want to make the point strongly that if about half the time the offender is a current or former intimate partner, that also means about half the time they aren't, right? They might be an acquaintance, sometimes a stranger, a family member, or a person of authority, like a supervisor or professor. And so I encourage you to think about, are you serving all victims of stalking, whether they're intimate partner stalkers or not? If you are not, do you know where to refer them? If you are, that's awesome. Would they know how to find you? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, an old coworker, I'm unlikely to reach out to an agency called like Family Violence Services, right? Because I'll be like, this isn't family violence. I'm not going to call a domestic violence hotline. And yet that's often where the best response to stalking is housed. And typically both for service providers and for our criminal justice system, the stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response. And so that's not wrong, but it is incomplete because there are not typically standalone stalking resources where folks can go. And so I encourage you to think through, and we have this checklist on our website that can help you as well. Just think through some of those questions like, okay, do we serve all victims of stalking? Do we have the word stalking prominently on our website? Do we do something for Stalking Awareness Month? When we include the National Hotline for DV and sexual assault, do we also include the Victim Connect hotline, which is the best resource for stalking victims, right? And so you can check this out on our website, and it'd be fun. You could do a Zoom call with your colleagues and go through and just think through your response and promotion of your stalking work. So stalking behaviors. Stalking behaviors can be quite varied. And I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are extremely creative criminals. People always tell me their most bizarre, disturbing, strange cases that they work on are stalking cases. So, for example, I read a case where the offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her home. That's a stalking case, right? I read a case where an offender mailed a snake with an aggressive letter and then pled not guilty. And we're like, but we know you mailed the snake. So it's always these weird, specific, disturbing things. And unfortunately, the only limit is the stalker's own creativity. And so we see a wide variety of behaviors. In fact, one thing to look out for is if a victim ever tells you, I know it sounds crazy, but that should be kind of a light bulb moment that this might be a stalking case because offenders go out of their way to do bizarre things that make that victim seem crazy. And I'll give you a few examples of that in a second. But if you ever hear a victim saying this, you should definitely be thinking like, maybe this is a stalking case. A lot of times when people think about stalking, they think primarily about surveillance. And that is often an important component of stalking, but it's not the only one. And so this is a really wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan, who developed this framework called SLY to help folks think a little bit more expansively about all the different types of stalking behaviors. And these can overlap and intersect, and that's okay. But just to give a sense of what some of that variety might be. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is that offender tracking, monitoring, watching, gathering information about the victim? Life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where that victim does not want the offender to be there. So they're trying to get through their normal day, and there's reminders that the stalker is there as part of their day. Similar is interference, which is how is the offender actually interfering with that victim's life. So what is the victim losing or afraid of losing or changing as a result of that stalker's behavior? And intimidation, implicitly or explicitly, how is that stalker intimidating the victim? And so if we had more time, I'd want you to do a big brainstorm, and feel free to share any cases or insights you have in the chat box, but I'm going to highlight just a few examples here of each kind. So surveillance, it could be following, watching, showing up, and a lot of times when stalkers are using technology, they are also stalking in person. So some only do one or the other, but a lot of times they'll use one to enhance the other, right? So it might be a GPS on a car, hacking into email accounts, but good old-fashioned driving by the home, showing up at the person's home or workplace, going through trash, all of that also. A lot of stalkers are doing both. We also see quite a bit of proxy stalking, and so that's really stalking through other people. So it's a shared social network or family network, shared custody, for example. We might see an offender say, oh, is daddy seeing anyone new? Is mommy taking you on vacation? That kind of thing, and getting information that way. Also just monitoring on social media. Sometimes stalkers create a fake account or impersonate somebody else that the victim trusts in order to, follow them on social media and see, oh, what events did they RSVP to? Where have they been lately? Where are they checking in? That kind of thing. Life invasion often takes the form of unwanted contact. So, the victim's trying to get through their day, and it's just constant texts, emails, messages from that offender. And you think how invasive that is, that you're just, every time you look at your phone, there's going to be another message there, or you fear there might be. We see a lot of property invasion. And so one thing that stalkers love to do is break into a victim's home or vehicle and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they were there. So, for example, maybe they leave the TV on a channel they and the victim used to watch together, or they move a lamp or something like that, or they leave a photo. And so when the victim gets home or back to their car, they might say, okay, I know the offender was in here, but what am I going to do, call the police and say the lamp moved? I'm going to sound crazy, right? And that's why we say, if they said, I know it sounds crazy, but the lamp moved, the TV was on, that kind of thing, that's actually a really common stalker behavior because nothing was broken or taken, and so it's hard to prove. We also see a lot of spreading rumors and public humiliation. So if you remember way back when I started talking, there were those three scenarios, and the middle one was an ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Is that stalking, yes or no? And you all were a little bit split on that. Of course, it would depend on the nature of the rumors. I'm sure people talk, people gossip, but what we often see in a stalking case is an offender very intentionally spreading vicious rumors that have a real impact and are very invasive in terms of that victim's life or opportunities. So, for example, I read a stalking case where the offender photoshopped images. So photoshopped the ex-partner's face, the victim, onto pornographic images, wrote out a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually, as well as her contact information, made a flyer, distributed it to everybody in her workplace and apartment complex, and sent it out online through a newsletter. Okay, so obviously that's more than just, oh, people gossip, right? That's very intentionally spreading a rumor that is invasive, could really impact her ability to get through her day, to not be contacted by strangers, that could impact her safety, as well as just her opportunities in terms of getting a job, being taken seriously at work, right? This is now something that she has to deal with. And so it's really invasive, in addition to being scary. And we see also that harassing friends and family. So, and you could think even how scary it is for a victim who feels like they've really gotten away from the offender to come to work, and a coworker says, oh, guess who I ran into? And they asked about you. So that kind of thing can happen as well and feel really invasive. Interference, so financial and work sabotage. The offender might do something like call the victim's workplace and say, know who I got terrible customer service from? That kind of thing. They can also hack into an account, and we see a lot of that online, impersonation or hacking. If you think about this, all the accounts that you have online, if the wrong person accessed those and had malicious intent, so we see offenders, taking out money, ruining credit, buying things, all of that kind of stuff. Again, ruining reputation, also a form of interference. And of course, actually interfering in terms of their physical health and safety, in terms of if there's a physical attack that makes them incapable of, continuing to live their normal lives, as well as property damage, So I read a case where an offender stole his ex-girlfriend's car and tried to sell it. Okay, so that's interference in terms of how she's supposed to get to work, right? So her life's been really interfered with. So all of the different kinds, and intimidation, and that can be explicit or implicit. Almost every example I just gave, most of us would feel intimidated by, would be my guess, right? That leaving that cup of coffee in the car, that's scary because it's saying I can get to you. Sometimes the threats are explicit. It's that I will harm you, I will do this, I will do that. But a lot of times it's more subtle than that. Property damage or symbolic violence, like a crushed can or something like that. We know when an offender threatens to harm themselves or actually does harm themselves, that's really intimidating and often signals an escalation of violence. And also threats the victim about harming the victim or to harm pets or others. So all of those. So these are just a few examples. And, again, I encourage you to share some cases you've worked on. Every training I do, I'm shocked by what people tell me a stalker has done. But the point of going through some of these behaviors is, again, to think broadly. It's not just surveillance, right? It's so many different tactics that could cause a person fear. And often these tactics are intersecting and being used to enhance each other. So we have an offender, let's say, watching a victim so they know where the victim is going to be, and then they are impersonating the victim online and saying, maybe they make up a fake dating profile and they say, hey, come find me straight. I'm wearing this and I'm at this coffee shop. And then they're approached by a stranger. And so now we have interference and we have surveillance working hand in hand, right? So these can really enhance each other in a bad way. And then another reason to think about it is that we want to think broadly about charging because sometimes you can charge stalking, sometimes you can't. But what you want to do in terms of charging decisions is build that history of bad conduct, right? That history of even if it's really minor offenses. So every state statute is different, but quite a few statutes have, even if they're minor misdemeanors, like I did a training in Virginia, and I don't remember the exact language, so I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like calling with the intent to annoy. Okay, so that's a crime, right? And so the reason you'd want to charge that, and some folks will say, well, what's the point? It's so small. But a lot of times victims feel like every time they reach out to law enforcement that it's the first time, when actually something's been going on for quite a long time. And so if now we have property damage, and 2 weeks ago there was that report or ideally charge on that, calling with an intent to annoy, okay, when we combine those, now we have a course of conduct. We have two or more. So you're really setting up that next person for success the next time something happens. If there's no account about that first incident, even if it's a minor one, we lose the potential for a stalking charge. And so I encourage you to think creatively and look at your criminal code, because sometimes folks will say, well, there's nothing we can do about that. There's actually a lot of small crimes that can at least be documented, if not charged. And if you want help looking through your criminal code, of course, feel free to reach out. Here are some of the most popular stalking behaviors: unwanted phone calls, messages, contacts, spreading rumors, following, or spying. And most offenders are using multiple strategies. So they're not just following, they're not just texting. About 80% are using more than one means of approach. 2/3 pursue their victim at least once per week. Many pursue daily. And this really shocked me when I learned this. The average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, so not the high end, the average is 2 years. And about 10% of cases last 5 years or more. So the recidivism rate is high across the board for stalking offenders, with that feeling that it's never over, that it just keeps happening, that the trauma and the actual stalking can be lifelong, right? So it really just never ends, and it feels like it never ends for victims. And so we're really looking at the long haul with these kinds of cases. In terms of the intersection of stalking and intimate partner violence, I see there's some discussion in the chat box. How do these things intersect? So let's talk about it just briefly. A lot of times in our field, let me go back a second. A lot of times in our field, I'll hear somebody say, it's often a he was abusive, she left, and from the day she left, he began stalking her. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back and look at that relationship, because if during the relationship he was contacting her constantly, showing up at her workplace, tracking her, asking friends and family where she was, filming her, threatening her, that's domestic violence, and it is stalking. It is both, and it can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. About half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well. So if you think about like what we often call digital abuse, what is that? More likely than not, it's stalking, and actually quite a few types of emotional abuse as well. If it involves that surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, that's stalking as well, because it's repeated behavior that would cause a reasonable person fear, and that is what quite a bit of domestic violence is. And it's actually an important thing to recognize, because a lot of times, we know that emotional abuse is devastating for victims and survivors, and yet often we hear, well, there's nothing we can do if they didn't physically hurt you, because unfortunately, it's not illegal to just be really, really mean. But it is illegal to stalk, right? And that's true during a relationship as well. And we want to know when that's happening, because while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, our intimate partner stalkers tend to be our most dangerous stalkers. And so they're more likely to physically approach the victim, be insulting, interfering, and threatening, use weapons, have their behaviors escalate quickly, and have those and be more likely to reoffend. Not only are intimate partner stalkers our most dangerous stalkers, but our intimate partners who stalk tend to be our most dangerous intimate partners. So, for example, this was a small study, women with protective orders. So all of these women had been abused, all of them had a protective order. But for the women who were abused and stalked, they experienced significantly higher rates of everything from verbal abuse to severe physical violence, sexual assault, threats with a weapon, and being beat up, and attacks with a weapon. These are just some of the measures. So it was that stalking, that it was an indicator that something else was going on here. And of course, we want to take all of our domestic violence cases seriously, and I'm not saying the stalking caused these behaviors, but rather when they're stalking in a domestic violence case, that should be a big red flag and a big kind of aha moment that, hey, this might be a really urgent case. This might be a high-risk case. There might be something else going on here, because those partners who stalk tend to be our most dangerous partners. And again, that homicide rate as well for intimate partners, stalking is predicting that. So really briefly as well, the intersection of stalking and sexual violence, there's quite a few ways this can intersect. So it might be that the stalker is planning to sexually assault the victim, so perhaps the stalker is stalking to gather information, right? When is the victim home? When is the victim alone? That kind of thing. Or they might threaten sexual violence as part of that course of conduct. So that's just that threatening, intimidating behavior. They might try to get someone else to sexually assault the victim. I'll talk about that in a second. They might actually assault the victim just as one of the crimes that's part of that course of conduct. Or sometimes the stalking case actually begins with the sexual assault, and then there's follow-up contact after, and that's when it becomes stalking. And so if you think about the idea of grooming for sexual violence, of course grooming looks different in different situations for different crimes, but generally it follows the same pattern, and this is true whether it's perhaps an online predator grooming a child for child pornography or sexual exploitation, grooming somebody for sex trafficking, or if we have our repeat serial rapists who are grooming potential victims. And so here's what they're going to do. So they're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. So on a college campus, that might be an upperclassman picking out the freshman women, right, who don't have a lot of drinking experience. On the internet, that might be the child predator looking for, a child from a minority population who doesn't have a lot of resources, who society tends to forget, right? They're going to identify that victim and then establish a relationship. So for that upperclassman, it's chatting up that lady after class. For that, adult predator, maybe they're contacting them and saying, oh, I understand you so much better than your parents. They're going to have multiple contacts and build some trust. Then at some point, they will meet in person. They'll usually initiate that meeting and isolate the victim, coerce them into sexual acts, one act or multiple acts, and then contact them after, either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two. And so I know I'm speaking really broadly here, but generally this is how offenders groom for sexual violence. So if you think about that through the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes. Is it directed at a specific person? Yes, they're identifying specific vulnerable victims and targeting them. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Yes, it would. Most people are afraid of sexual violence, and even in the more restrictive statutes, most of them spell out physical safety and sexual violence as like specific things that you could be afraid of that would qualify. So you might be thinking, but when though? Because that child or that, freshman woman may not have been afraid on day one, right? They might say, no, this person seemed great. But now when I look back and realize this entire relationship was a setup for this, sexual exploitation, that's terrifying. And it all started with that text message. It all started with that Facebook chat, And so there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So even if the victim's saying, I wasn't afraid on day one, but now that I look back, it's really scary, that could still be a stalking case. And this also goes for if the victim didn't know about some of the stalking behavior till later. So you can't be afraid someone's watching you if you don't know someone's watching you. But if the victim finds out later and their reaction is to be afraid, that could still be stalking. So fear can attach at any time. In terms of that, getting someone else to sexually assault the victim, we see quite a bit of impersonation in stalking cases because really all you need to set up a profile on a social media website or a dating website is a photo and an email. And so sometimes we see offenders posing as the victim and pretending to be the victim, saying, here's where I live and here's what I'm into, and if I yell and scream, it's all just part of my fantasy. And so we've seen several cases in which that person is assaulted, not directly by the offender, but by someone that the offender has essentially solicited to sexually assault that victim. When most people read a case like that, their first thought may not be, oh, this is stalking. But it also could be stalking, right? Because if it's going along with other behaviors, which it likely is, and it would be scary to somebody, whether the assault takes place or not, to be a stalking case. So I keep saying, we need to name stalking, call it stalking. If you see it, we need to know it. And you might be thinking, well, why though? Like, I'm already doing this important work and taking victims seriously. Why does it matter if I call it stalking or domestic violence or whatever? So there's a few reasons why it's not just intellectually interesting to think of these behaviors that I'm sure you're working with victims on already as stalking. It's actually very practical as well. So, for example, for charging options, right? And so, again, stalking is really undercharged. And so most prosecutors like having a menu of options. And so if you can add stalking, that's great. And also because we want to hold our stalking offenders accountable. If we don't call it stalking or recognize it's stalking, we're not going to charge stalking. Also, it's a great charge for prosecutors when they understand it. And here's why. Because if you're charging, especially, let's say, domestic violence, and you're looking at an incident of assault or battery, typically that prosecutor is not going to be able to bring up that time 2 years ago when the offender stood outside sending creepy pictures to the victim, right? Because they're going to say that's prejudicial, that's not relevant to this assault that's, allegedly happened 2 weeks ago. But if you're charging stalking, you bring in the entire course of conduct. And so that prosecutor can paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible that offender really was. I've had plenty of prosecutors say to me, oh yeah, the jury didn't convict on the battery, they convicted on that coffee cup in the car, right? They convicted on those creepy details we can't get out of our head. And those are much more likely to come in with a stalking charge. And so it's actually a really powerful one. Also, safety planning. Again, stalking has its own risks. It's an escalated risk for victims, and so we want to know when that's going on so that we can identify it and safety plan appropriately and treat those cases with the urgency that they deserve. And victim empowerment. It can go quite a long way for a victim to, instead of saying, oh, my ex is being creepy, or I'm kind of annoyed with my old friend, to be able to say, I'm experiencing stalking. And that's a real thing. And there are resources available, and other people experience this, and it's a crime, right? So just having that language can go a really long way. In terms of responding to victims, and of course this is just kind of the very high-level advice, and we can go much further on that, you want to advise disengagement. And so that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if an offender calls 100 times, the victim picks up the phone and says, "I hate you, don't call me," tomorrow the offender's calling 101 times because they see that as a win. That being said, disengagement is not always possible or realistic. And sometimes reaching out to an offender happens. It's part of life, and it's part of a safety plan even. So, for example, there was a case where it came out, it was being prosecuted, and it came out in trial that the victim had called the offender at 2 a.m. and talked for 3 hours. And so the defense is saying, well, how scared could she be? Why would she call him then? So we asked the victim, and the victim said, well, yeah, I knew that's when he got off work at the bar. So I called him, I heard him get in his car, drive home, fall asleep, so I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, wake up my kids. So it's that keep your enemies closer kind of thing, right? It's not perfect, but it's real. And unfortunately, there's a lot of offices, whether it's because the protective order or for the prosecutor, who will throw out a case if they see that the victim reached out to the offender. So I really encourage you to, yes, advise disengagement and let the victim know, hey, that may not always be possible, and so let's safety plan around it. Let's talk about that. Let's be able to explain that and do some advocacy for that victim with others. Documentation is also really, really critical, and often I hear people saying, oh yeah, we always tell victims to document, but sometimes we don't tell them how. So they end up saying, it was a sunny spring day when this, and we're like, oh no, we can't read all this. And so one thing we have on our website, and of course you're free to use or adapt, is an incident log that's very succinct. So just date, time, description, location. The location is critical because there's often jurisdictional issues in these stalking cases, and victims don't understand jurisdiction. And these cases can be really the long haul. And so, again, many victims feel like every time they call law enforcement, it's the first time. And they'll say, but I called the police before. What do you mean you don't have the report? And it's because it was over the county line, or sometimes even within that same department, we know the day shift doesn't always talk to the night shift, right? It's just the reality of our system. And so having that location, as well as if the police were called, the report number, an officer name and badge number. And that's not to be punitive or critical of the officer, but just to help that victim keep track and connect the dots, as well as, of course, the witness name and how to contact that witness. And so this is an easy way to summarize the stalking case and show all of those different stalking behaviors, and that even if they seem minor on their own, the way that they add up, and to help connect the dots across jurisdictions and time. Another great tool that I want to refer you to is SHARP. This is free. It's online. You can get to it at stalkingrisks.org, or we also have it linked on our website, stalkingawareness.org. It's wonderful. It's developed by the same researcher, T.K. Logan, who developed the SLY framework. And this is a risk assessment specifically for the crime of stalking, intimate partner or not intimate partner. So again, free, powerful risk assessment, summarizes the stalking case, and will give you a narrative report as well as some safety planning suggestions, and you can test it out before you're across from a victim. So I highly, highly recommend it. What we really need in these cases is coordination. And I know that it's easy to pay lip service to coordination. It's harder to do in practice. And we are busy, and we are in silos, and we have different priorities and perspectives and a lot going on. And I recognize that. But what happens so often with especially our stalking cases is that different agencies know different information. So maybe law enforcement in one jurisdiction knows something, but the campus law enforcement knows something else, and the victim advocate knows a different piece of information, but wasn't able to share that with the prosecutor. And of course, with victim privacy in mind, we really need to see that coordination, because we need our public educators to be letting the victims know about stalking so that when they're experiencing it, they take it seriously and report it. We need then our victim advocates to see the sense of urgency and connect them with the right resources. We need our law enforcement to charge it, to have those protective orders to keep those victims safe and hold offenders accountable. We need our prosecutors to take up that charge and argue it effectively. And we need our courts to then have the appropriate sentencing. And we need our probation and parole to recognize stalking behavior, and so they can continue keeping that victim safe after that offender's been sentenced. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose stalking victims, and they fall through our system. Our system's set up for an incident, not a pattern of behavior. That is what stalking is. These cases are difficult, and they happen, again, different areas, different jurisdictions over a long period of time, and there's no one who's in charge of pulling these pieces together. So it kind of has to be you, and whatever role that you play, connecting the dots and bringing people together and building a sense of urgency and a coordinated response around stalking. I know I'm just about at time here, and the closed captioner might have to go. I'm just going to leave you with a couple of resources and then sign off. So a few resources to continue your work. Again, SPARK is a project of Equitas. They are the prosecutor's resource for violence against women, and they are happy to talk to any prosecutors about better prosecuting stalking as well as related crimes. Also a great go-to in terms of analyzing your stalking statute. So they're free, 24/7 technical assistance, and so definitely recommend them as a great resource. If you want to learn more about technology and stalking and victim safety using technology, the NMEDD Tech Safety app, as well as just their entire website and team, are great at just learning more about being safer using technology. Great to educate yourself as well as victims you might be working with. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. So please don't refer victims directly to SPARK, because all we'll do is be really nice and refer them back to Victim Connect, and they help refer out to local service providers, which typically are sexual assault and domestic violence service providers. But again, be mindful if you're sharing, the DV hotline, make sure you share this as well for stalking victims. January is National Stalking Awareness Month, which hopefully you all knew and were pumped about this past January. But just in case you weren't, now you know for next year, and we house all those resources. So we house, social media resources and activity ideas and all that good stuff. So definitely keep up with us to promote those efforts in your community. And that can all be found along with other things at stalkingawareness.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and, of course, follow us on social media at Follow Us Legally. And here's just some of the few things that we offer here. Individual assistance, in-person training, which we're not accepting requests for right now until fall, but we can do more webinars, specific ones for you, online resources, and we're a relatively new project. We were funded in 2017, and so we know all of this is easier said than done, and we want to help you do your work. So I just want to thank you so much for your time and attention and the great conversation in the chat box, and for the critical work that you're doing now and every day to help victims and hold offenders accountable. It's easy for me to say, well, consider stalking and do this and do that, but it's much harder to actually be there on the ground doing it. So I just want to say thank you so much. I know it's difficult, and we want to be a resource for you here at SPARK. So if you've had an idea for a resource that would help you, if you're working on a stalking case and are wondering, what kind of technology was used or something like that, if you'd like further training, you can request that on our website. We're happy to work with you, and I hope this is the first time we're talking, if it's the first time that you're hearing from me and not the last. So please stay safe, stay healthy, hopefully, and feel free to follow us and reach out. Thank you so much, and I will hand that back to Daniel.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to close the webinar room, and have a great day.